Hi all and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Over the past couple of videos we've taken a look at some of my favorite Palm smartphones, including the Palm Pre and the Palm Trēo 650, and today I thought that it could be a fun idea to look at my entire collection. Remember, if you enjoy videos like this, to subscribe and also give me a big thumbs up. And first up we have my first ever Palm smartphone, the Trēo Pro. Now, I bought this back in high school when what I actually wanted was one of these, a Palm Pre. However, this hadn't quite come out yet in Australia at least, and it never would actually. So I got this as a bit of a stopgap. And to be honest, it wasn't the worst thing in the world. While it was running Windows 6.1, which wasn't the slickest or the most attractive interface, I did at least bring a little bit of webOS onto it because, as you can see here, I put the Palm Pre's original wallpaper. If we compare it with the original Pre, yes, I've got that iconic picture. If anyone has a link to a higher resolution version, I would absolutely love that. Anyway, so in high school, this wasn't the worst smartphone in the world. As we can see, it's got some influence of the old style Palm Treos with the candy bar form factor, the resistive touchscreen, and also the shortcut buttons over here. However, it's also been influenced by the iPhone, namely the 3G. As you can see, it's got a glossy black back cover, which while some people hate it, I actually don't think it dated that badly, because if we compare it to some of the later phones like the Pre with a soft touch back cover, which was more popular at the time, well, these have become more sticky and tacky now, and that's not exactly a good thing. Also, some people said at the time that if you covered the Palm logo, well, it looks exactly like an iPhone. So compared to an iPhone 3G at the time, well, this had comparable specifications with a 400 megahertz processor, a touchscreen that's 320 by 320 pixels if you actually use it. Because it's got a resistive touchscreen, it's actually rather terrible, particularly how I managed to break and lose my stylus. And I can barely pick out at any of the interface icons. Unlike Palm OS, Windows is tremendously difficult to use. And I don't know if you can tell, but the screen is rather washed out. And to show you guys the extent of the color reproduction of the screen, here was my favorite game on the phone, Bubble Breaker, where you had to tap certain portions of the screen where there were three colors in a row. Wow, how fun was that at high school? Okay, to be honest, while this is a little bit of a novelty now, compared to an iPhone at the time, I am quite shocked that I chose to buy this because this is nowhere near as nice to use. Actually, at the time, I was carrying an iPod Touch, which sort of shows how little I enjoyed using this phone. Nonetheless, it does have a pretty good keyboard, and it's got the Palm name, so that's great. And also, I did enjoy using Microsoft Word on this. It's got the full Office suite, albeit you can't really create new PowerPoints, but if you want to write an essay on it, Microsoft Word is fantastic. Okay, and in conclusion, I think I'd probably give the Trēo Pro a 6 out of 10 possibly. This might be a little bit harsh, but just tell me in the comments if you think you'd give the Trēo Pro a different score. So I used this phone for almost a couple of years. I was okay with it. However, what I really wanted was a webOS phone. So I kept on waiting for one to come out in Australia. We saw the Pre, the original Pre, and then we also saw the Pre Plus come out, which was the upgraded model. However, it was only until the Pre 2 of 2011. Yes, it was 2010 that I actually got my first webOS phone. And instantly, from just picking this up, there is a massive problem. It is just so disgusting and sticky. The soft touch plastic is actually disintegrated into a bit of a sticky mess. While some people actually preferred the soft touch plastic to the glossy plastic of the Trēo at the time, well, I can tell you that the glossy plastic definitely dated a lot better. Nonetheless, I shall get past the stickiness and show you more about the phone. So if we turned it on, you can tell that it's Palm's first ever glass display. because previously all of the screens were plastic, which scratched rather easily. I never actually put a screen protector on this thing. And let me tell you that the Gorilla Glass actually still looks pretty much perfect. As you can see below, there's a lovely gesture area. Getting the Pre 2 after using the Trēo Pro so long was such a breath of fresh air. It was quite amazing actually, because we went from using a resistive screen with a clunky interface and having to use the D-pad all the time to a full touchscreen with a gesture area. It was sort of like stepping 10 years into the future. I imagine this was how using the first iPhone was like after using Windows Mobile and Symbian and phones like that for so long. What was fantastic with this phone is that unlike the original Pre and the Pre Plus, which had their fair share of performance issues, this thing was actually fairly blazing fast. Nothing to complain about. In fact, with 512 megabytes of RAM, I think people did some tests on it, and actually, I said it was fast, but this is actually extremely slow. Some people actually got over 50 apps running simultaneously.
Say it's fast with the time.
Okay, this seems quite slow, but trust me, at the time it felt fast. Music still hasn't loaded. Oh dear, and it's frozen. Okay, I assume there's something wrong with it, but at the time it felt blazing fast. In fact, one of the things I did with it was overclock it. It had the base clock speed of 1 gigahertz, and then I was very impressed how you could clock it up to 1.4 and I think up to 1.7 at a point, which was ridiculous. Ruined your battery life, but yes. Oh look, music's finally loaded. Let's have a look at some of my 2010 playlists. Who did I listen to? I guess we'll never know. This is, oh, there we go. So it was a lot of Harry Potter soundtracks and,
Scrolling.
oh my god, the scrolling. And a bit of feeder. Okay, this is a bit painful, but I'm sure it was definitely faster in the past. And as you can see here, what was great with this phone is that it had the webOS interface. So you had the gestures, you had the cards that you just threw away, and in webOS 2, which the Pre 2 had, you can actually stack them together. So what I used to like doing was having all of my social media in one particular stack, and then I'd have games in another one, and then a few internet tabs in another. So what was particularly terrible with my experience of using a webOS phone like the Pre 2 in 2010 in Australia was that we didn't get our own version of the App Store. In fact, if you registered your phone in Australia to begin with, you were actually completely locked out of getting apps apart from sideloading them. So what I had to do was tell the person I bought this phone from to open the box themselves and actually activate it in America so I'll get access to the American App Store, which is a ridiculous workaround. And even then, you needed an American credit card to purchase apps. So with my complete lack of any sort of credit card really, at the time, I was just limited to free apps, apart from the ones that I would torrent and then sideload. Another thing that I enjoyed with this phone, particularly over the Trēo Pro, which had a real lack of any decent games to play, was actually fun ports of iPhone games. For example, there was Assassin's Creed. Obviously, I had the free version. And then I had Angry Birds Rio, obviously the free version. But what my favorite game probably at the time was a little game called the helicopter game. Let's have a look at that. Okay, well, it was pretty good with this, unlike some other versions of the helicopter game where you had to physically tap the screen. You can use the space bar to control your helicopter. Well, this screen I think was more colorful and it was sharper than the iPhones at the time. It's actually got fairly bad viewing angles. Not that you can't see the screen, rather the colors would fade quite weirdly. Despite this, I think this was the last Palm phone to have a transflective display, which means that if you view it under sunlight, it would actually, you could actually read it without the use of the backlight. So it was almost like an e-ink display in that way. Okay, so this was probably the first phone that I had with a semi-decent camera. It was a 5 megapixel unit back here with what Palm called an extended depth of view. This basically meant that instead of having autofocus, they tried to sharpen the image so that everything was in focus, all at the same time. So it wasn't the best camera, but it was all right. For example, I took this beautiful image of my Kindle at the time, and even today, I think it looks all right. Just ignore how laggy it is. I'm sure it wasn't that laggy at the time. Even looking back at some of the images at the time on a big screen, on my iMac for instance, I think that the images were all right. Just all right. And overall, because this was such a monumental leap over the Trēo Pro, I would probably give this phone a 9 out of 10. Just for how revolutionary it was for me personally. Okay, so after the Pre 2, the next Palm phone that was to come out was the Veer, which was this tiny little thing over here. But since I didn't actually own one during the time, we shall talk about this a little bit later. The next phone that I actually got from Palm was the Pre 3. However, this actually came out after HP closed down Palm. So this was one of the very rare late devices that they never officially released. However, this was probably my favorite Palm phone that they ever released because it actually felt like a quality piece of hardware. The original Pre felt a little bit cheap and plasticky, and while the Pre Plus did improve things a little bit, it's still, even today particularly, the sticky plastic does not feel fantastic. And the Pre 2, while they tried to improve the build quality a bit, they sort of ruined it by ruining the looks, by giving it the flat screen. The Pre 3, on the other hand, was quite a sleek and minimalistic looking device, I believe. And the keyboard was actually one of the best keyboards I ever used. Because this phone was never officially released, after the closure of Palm, a few AT&T employees slowly leaked the Pre 3s onto eBay. Initially, they cost well over $1,000. However, after a little while, they dropped down to around $300–400, and that's when I grabbed this one. And I had a few issues with it. Because it wasn't officially released, there were a few bugs. So on Telstra, unfortunately, there was a little bit of a glitch whenever you were using 3G, there was a likelihood of the phone just randomly restarting and wasting all of your battery. And because of that, you had to switch it manually to 2G over here. And then by doing that, your phone won't shut down whenever you're using it. And then the idea would be that you would use 3G when you actually wanted okay internet. Apart from that little glitch, however, I thought this was a really fun phone to use. Not only did it have a pretty good camera, 5 megapixels with autofocus at the time, it actually had a really beautiful screen. 480 by 320 pixels, I think, something like that, which meant that it was pretty much retina, as in you can, like, no matter how close you look, you can't really discern the pixels, and the colors were actually beautiful and all of that. And if you actually look at it, the glass was slightly curved, which is interesting. Obviously, you've got a gesture area down here, and this phone was actually just very snappy and fun to use. Although technically it had a little bit less RAM than the Pre 2, so sometimes you would just run out of RAM and the phone would freeze. I actually used this phone as my personal phone for quite a bit of time, so I did actually install quite a few apps here. Because this was the first Palm phone to be over 420 by 320 pixels, it meant that a lot of apps had to be updated to take advantage of the screen. For example, Angry Birds Lite would have black bars on the side, which wasn't great, but it sort of reminded me of when Apple went with the iPhone 5 and a lot of apps had to be updated. Unfortunately, because webOS had been discontinued at the time, a lot of apps did not get updated. However, you were actually able to install some HP touchpad tablet apps onto this because it used something called Enyo, which was a new form of application architecture, which would just reframe for whatever screen size you had. Unfortunately, because this wasn't natively designed for that, we had to wait for webOS 3 for that, and this was running webOS 2.2.3, 4, something like that. It was just extremely laggy. all of the Enyo apps, and they actually didn't resize properly. As you can see, it is absolutely tiny. Quite an unfortunate thing with this phone is that it isn't dating too well because it's got a yellowing keyboard. This is actually the same thing that's happening with my Veer, I think. No, I think it's much more apparent on the Pre 3. But at least although it's a soft touch plastic, which feels very nice, it hasn't started to deteriorate yet. I'm wondering if this is inevitable or if they actually used a better quality plastic than the Palm days. The Veer, the black Veer, which I've got over here, is actually, it feels like it's the same material as the Pre 3, and it hasn't become sticky yet, while the earlier Palm branded phones have all consistently become a little bit sticky, even if they've just been stored inside a box. So I used this phone up until late 2012, I think, because there's nothing quite as depressing as using a phone with an operating system that has lost all support. This means that almost every single month you'll see a few apps stop working, and then say your friends are on Instagram now, you don't have an Instagram app, stuff like that. And because of the random restarts as well, I eventually turned to the iPhone 5 when that came out. And while that was a better phone in a lot of ways, webOS was always the better and nicer operating system to use. For example, the card interface that we've got here, where you can launch several applications and just flick between them. This isn't something that we got until the iPhone 10. And even now, I don't believe it's as slick as webOS. Because this was the final webOS phone, and if I forgive it for some of the glitches that it had, because it never really came out officially, I'll give this a 9 out of 10 as well. This was a really good phone. And after my time with the Pre 3, I actually did go back and collect all of the other phones I was missing. For example, the original Pre. Unfortunately, this one has a broken touchscreen, but I've got another one coming, so that is fine. And then the Pre Plus, which I've used a little bit. When it's overclocked, it actually feels pretty fast because you can overclock this to 1 gigahertz, and also it's got a lot of RAM, 512 megabytes. Also, let's note that the original Pre does have the home button over here. While my brother Dennis does feel that this makes it intrinsically better than the completely buttonless Pre Plus, I actually prefer having a clean gesture area, as when you're doing your gestures, they're not impeded by the button. However, the problem is that you have no idea which way is up. Like, you'll just pick out your phone and then, no, that's not quite right, is it? One of my favorite Palm phones, actually, surprisingly, is the Pixi. Not only is that because this is a fun orange color, but it's actually a nice candy bar design, which I quite like. You don't have to put in a lot of effort into opening the phone just to type something out. While this has one of the smallest keyboards of any Palm phone, it's actually one of the most comfortable and incredibly clicky. Unfortunately, while I do love this form factor, it's got a pretty terrible, mediocre display, and it is extremely slow. If you thought the original Pre was slow, this is even slower than that. However, despite that, it's still a very, very pleasant phone to use. And I think Austin Evans said that this was his first ever smartphone. And I don't think that was, this would have been such a bad place to start. Although the camera on this was also only 2 megapixels. And what photos have we taken on here? Here's a photo of our workspace from a long time ago. And yeah, 2 megapixels doesn't really cut it these days. The replacement for the Pixi was the Veer. I've got both colors over here. I love the Veer because not only of the extremely cute design, but also this was the first properly portless phone, I think. So all of the current rumors are that Apple will eventually get rid of the Lightning port soon in favor of a magnetic connector. Well, this is something that Palm did over 10 years ago now. So you can see here, the only port is this magnetic connector over here. There's no headphone jack or USB port. And then if you want to listen to music, you can either use Bluetooth or this magnetic headphone adapter, which is just fantastic. Also, obviously, you have the touchstone charging dock on the back. So if you want evidence of a completely portless phone working well, the Veer was that. The Veer also, I would argue, was the best performing Palm phone. It had a pretty fast 800 megahertz processor, but it had far less pixels to run than the Pre 3, and it's just extremely smooth. Even in apps where it would traditionally be slow, for example, opening the Photos app and scrolling through your photos, it's still relatively brisk and performance just feels fantastic. I'd say I give the Veer a good 9 out of 10 as well. If you can get past the tiny little screen, it's just a pleasure to use. The keyboard is pretty fantastic as well. Oh yes, and obviously you've got a little lanyard holder over here. So for a little period of time, I tried to wear it around my neck, and while it's a little bit too heavy for that to be comfortable, it is something that you can do. What's interesting is that the white one was actually a bit of a hard plastic, while the black one was a bit of a soft touch, but they're both pretty good. And so that was my Palm webOS collection. If you owned any of these phones, tell me in the comments below. Do you have any fun memories? And do you guys still use them occasionally? Because to be honest, while these phones are great, it's pretty difficult to find a use for them today. Make sure you subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed. And on that note, toodaloo.